I really don't want to skip the connection between our oral microbiome and our health. And I know that you really opened up in the 5 questions to nourish your mind, body, and soul on our compassionate cure. And one of the things that you spoke about was like your fertility journey and how much, it's been a really hard journey for you to get there. Something that I'm seeing hugely is not just in women struggling to conceive, but it is in men's sperm quality and men being more infertile than ever before. And so it's huge. People are having less children for a variety of reasons, but then actually people that are wanting to have children are struggling, really struggling. And it's not just the women. So when I was reading your book, I was really surprised. What is the connection here? Let's start with men, because I think maybe they are ones that don't get enough airtime at the moment with this because it's quite a new area. But with men and the oral microbiome, how is this affecting their fertility? Like if anyone's maybe listening and struggling, this might be one area that they've not thought about.
I love that you're bringing this up and that we're starting with the men, because so often in being a patient who's gone through fertility treatment, the focus is always on the woman of, something is wrong with you and your reproductive system and this is all your fault and you need to be optimized. But what we know from science is that 50% of all infertility arises in the man. So it's equal, it's on equal people, or it's equal people's responsibility in terms of trying to have this kid. And it takes 2 to make a child, right? And so what we do know, and what you mentioned, is that sperm quality and quantity have really gone down. And this is a whole host of reasons why, but one of the contributing factors is oral microbiome. And so what we know is that if people have an infection in their mouth, that bacteria will actually get into the bloodstream and get into the sperm and infect the sperm. So men oftentimes will have, it's hard to say this word, but bacterial spermarima, which is bacteria in the sperm. So their sperm will be infected. And that can actually reduce the quantity of sperm that they have. It will reduce their ability to swim. So they'll have, some men will say, I have slow swimmers. Oftentimes that is related to the mouth, to the oral microbiome, or it'll change the shape of the head of the sperm, making it less likely to penetrate the egg and make an embryo. And so you can have that if you have a dysbiosis in the oral microbiome. That could be one cause of this. The other thing that can happen is that men oftentimes will suffer from erectile dysfunction. So if men have an infection of PG in their mouth, which is a specific bacteria, Porphyromonas gingivalis, that bacteria will actually decrease arginine production. And arginine is a precursor to nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a very potent vasodilator, and you need vasodilation in order to achieve an erection. So a lot of times men will come in and they really don't care at all about oral microbiome and what I'm talking to them about. But as soon as I say, if you have a dysbiosis in your oral microbiome, you're 2.85 times more likely to have erectile dysfunction. All of a sudden, they're perking up, they're leaning in, they're asking more questions, because it will change the mount, shape, and swimming ability of sperm, but also impact their ability to achieve an erection. And if you don't get an erection, you can't have a baby.
Wow. I mean, I think anyone listening to this now is going to perk up, especially as soon as something turns in with sex organs. Everyone wants to know. And actually, the person who wrote your book, your foreword for your book, Dr. Victoria Sampson, who's getting a lot of airtime at the moment, I heard that she wrote a stat, or she said a stat around that she talked about a study which looked at sub-fertile men, and 90% of them had a dental disease or an infection. And they split them into 2 groups. And one group had treatment for obviously the oral disease or infection. And the ones that had treatment saw a 70% improvement in their sperm quality and pregnancy rates. Like that overall just blew my mind. And you've just given that an incredible explanation as to why. But I think when even like hearing that stat, 70%, it's so interesting that there's not a connection with fertility doctors and having this conversation, because I think, we'll talk about stress, we'll talk about, food and diet and maybe reducing your alcohol to help sperm quality. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about the oral microbiome.
No, they don't even really talk about oral microbiome for women and improving their chances of conception either. And I was a fertility patient for 6 years at 2 of the top reproductive endocrinologist clinics in America. And none of them asked me about my oral health, not once, even though I was having these failed pregnancies or miscarriages, never once asked me about my oral microbiome. And that's kind of what kind of dove me into, well, what else could be, contributing to this? But it's critically important.
How does it affect the women? So we've just spoke about the men. How does a woman's oral microbiome affect female fertility and pregnancy?
Yeah. So, I could do a whole day course on this. So try and actually, I do have an online course about this. It is affecting the entire journey. So, it affects women's ability to ovulate. It affects their ability to have the embryo implant. It affects the ability to maintain the pregnancy. It affects miscarriage and stillbirth rates. It affects preterm labor and low birth weight babies. And it also increases risk of having gestational diabetes and preeclampsia. So the whole gamut of women's health, which is why in my new clinic, we have a whole department of my new clinic devoted to women's health. This is how passionate I am about this topic, because the oral microbiome affects every step of that way. And what I tell women is whether or not you want to have a baby, you're still a woman and you still are entitled to optimal health. And unfortunately, in the world we live in, women's health is severely neglected. A lot of times, women's health recommendations are based off of being a small man, right? They do studies on men and then they say women are just smaller versions of men. And so
Dr.
this
Stacey
could be
Sims.
Yes, this could be this is what we'll recommend for women, but we are completely biologically and physiologically different than men. And so we need to have people dedicated to women, because even if you don't have a child, you could be afflicted with things like PCOS and endometriosis, which, by the way, there was a study that came out in 2023 stating that 64% of all endometriosis cases were contributed to oral FN, Fusobacterium nucleatum. Oral bacteria causing FN, or not causing, oral bacteria were found in 64% of endometriosis cases in the tissue.
Wow.
Wild.
That's huge.
And in my book, I talk about this, and I wrote my book before the study came out, but I had a patient that came in and she was young, healthy, no systemic health issues. But when we did her exam, her gums, she was bleeding like a stuck pig. That is one of the things we say in the US when someone has a bleeding gum. She was bleeding like a stuck pig. And my hygienist came and got me right away and said, hey, I think something else is going on. So we did a microbiome test. Her FN was off the chart. We treated her pretty aggressively, had her come back in 3 months, tested her again. Her FN was down and her clinical presentation was improved, but it still something didn't look right. So I sent her to her primary care doctor and they did some tests and they found out she had systemic endometriosis. She had lesions in her lungs. And if we wouldn't have tested, and we sent her saliva test to her doctor, of course, but if we wouldn't have tested, we would have never known. And she actually came back and worked for me at one of my remote clinics because she said that we saved her life. And so she wanted she wanted to be part of something like that was able to help other people. So that was pretty powerful. But yeah, so even if you don't want to have a baby, there's, our reproductive system is the essence, right, of being a woman. And so anything that we can do to make sure that that's healthy and optimize that is what we want to do.